Hello, IB. I've decided to take some of my slide presentations that I use in class and record myself talking through them so that you can use this as a resource to help you review for the IB exam. Now, I'm limited here to 30 minutes using this particular recording software. So I've taken my presentations and broken them down into chunks. And you're free to just listen all the way through. However, the way I'm going to present to you here is the way I would present it in class, which means that there are a few points where I would pause for discussion, conversation, or I would pause to have you write down your ideas on paper. So there will be various points in this presentation where I'll say, now, if you'd like, pause here and think about what I'm saying. So for today, we are taking a look at China under Mao Zedong. We're taking a look at the very first couple of years of the People's Republic of China. And in particular, if we take a look at the IB syllabus or bullet points for this section 14, the People's Republic of China, the things I'm going to touch on relate to the first bullet point, the consolidation of the communist state under Mao, and some of their policies. And specifically today, we're looking at foreign policy. We're going to be looking at the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, and we're going to be taking a look at the Korean War, which relates to Sino-American relations. So to start us off, I'd like to turn it over to you to think about this question, to warm up your brain. So imagine the year is 1949, you are Mao Zedong, and there you are, smoking one of your maybe Panda brand cigarettes. You've just established the People's Republic of China. Congratulations. Now, I'd like you to think about what are your immediate domestic and international challenges or concerns. To help you think about this, think about where China is coming from. We had, some limited industrial development with the self-strengthening movement. Then 1911, the Republic of China is established, but it's very short-lived. Yuan Shikai takes over, tries to bring back an imperial system. And then there's decades of warlordism. And then there's a Chinese Civil War. And then there's World War II. And now World War II is over, but we're entering into the Cold War. So just a few things to have on your radar. Here's a place to pause, think about domestic and international challenges, and then in a few seconds, I will advance to the next slide. I'll come back to that map momentarily. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are some things you might have said. So domestically, Mao needs to establish a central government. China was being operated under the Kuomintang, the GMD, which historically used to be the acronym used to be the KMT, based on an old Romanization system. So establish a communist government, replacing the GMD, overcoming decades of disunity. I mean, after a very short-lived Republic of China, the country was fractured because of warlords, because of civil war, because of Japanese invasion. And even though the P.R.C. is established, the communists still have to eliminate the last remnants of the folks loyal to the Kuomintang. There's rampant corruption in China that's been a problem for quite some time, as we saw in this course. They have made a lot of promises based on communist and socialist ideas, which they have to live up to. They have to win over the hearts and minds, in particular, of people like middle-class people, bourgeois people, maybe some intellectuals, people that are on the fence about communists. And their economy is decimated. First of all, they were never fully industrialized, but decades of warlordism, civil war, and war with Japan have left the country ravaged. Now, internationally, the PRC is going to want to establish friendly relations with powerful countries, with their neighbors. They are going to need to gain international recognition because the GMD is currently recognized in the world as the legitimate government of China. They have a seat the United Nations Security Council. Um, and then coming back to this map here, if we take a look at China's the geography of Asia at the time, China has a few countries on their border that could potentially pose a threat. Japan is occupied by the United States. The United States rewrites Japan's constitution. The Korean Peninsula has been divided in half. The lower half is under U.S. influence. The Philippines are under U.S. influence. The Kuomintang on Taiwan is backed by the U.S. So China has some powers in the region that could potentially be a threat to them, and we'll see that with the Korean War. And it's 1949, and the Cold War is now pretty much in full swing, and we're going to see with the start of the Korean War, the Cold War comes to China's doorstep. So, with that having been said, let me move my bubble. Sorry. With that having been said, the first couple of years of the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party is totally locked in, and they are getting so much done. So I picked this highly touched up, highly photoshopped propaganda picture of Mao Zedong, just on his grind, signing paperwork. He's got piles of government documents at his desk there. But if we take a look here at this list, I mean, it's pretty impressive what they do in their first couple of years. October 1st, 1949, Mao proclaims the People's Republic of China from the wall of the Forbidden City in Beijing. And one of his first acts is to travel abroad. And this is, in fact, the first time that Mao ever travels abroad, and he goes to the Soviet Union. If I'm not mistaken, the only trips that Mao ever took outside of China were 2 trips to the USSR, if I remember correctly. He makes that trip in order to make sure that the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship gets signed. In 1950, a marriage law is put into effect, which drastically changes the institution of marriage in China. And then if you look here, October of 1950, so the PRC is 1 year old, and China finds themselves engaged in a massive international Cold War conflict, the Korean War. And that's what we're going to cover in this presentation. There's some other things that happen in the early years: suppression of counter-revolutionaries campaign, massive land reform program, and then the 3 and 5 anti-campaigns. Today, we're going to focus, or I should say, in this presentation, we're going to focus on the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and the Korean War. So, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, on one hand, you would think, oh, well, the Soviet Union and China are natural allies. They're both communist countries. They're neighbors. They should be best friends. Well, their relationship got off to a little bit of a rocky start because my first paragraph here, Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin are both very egotistical, maybe narcissistic personalities, and they're used to having people fawning over them and hanging on their every word. So these 2 men were 2 very big personalities in the room together. And furthermore, Stalin was known to sometimes make foreign dignitaries wait as kind of like a, like a negotiation tactic to kind of make them sweat a little bit, or, put them off so they were not on balance. So Mao arrived in Moscow, and he was sort of snubbed for a couple of days, and that got them off to a bad start. And I chose this photograph on purpose. Typically when you see photos of Mao, he's got a beaming smile because it's been touched up, or it's propaganda poster or photograph. But here, Mao looks kind of grumpy, or maybe even miserable. And number one, he was not someone who liked to travel abroad. And number two, he and Stalin did not have the greatest relationship. And as we go further in this course, coming down the road is a phenomenon called the Sino-Soviet split. And that's where Communist China and the Soviet Union go their separate ways. So We're sort of, you know, previewing that a little bit right now. During the Civil War, the Stalin had played the two sides off of each other a little bit. Did not come down 100% supporting the Chinese Communist Party, which is what you might think that they would have done. As a matter of fact, Stalin had signed a treaty with Chiang Kai-shek in 1945, promising not to support the CCP in exchange for the use of a railroad network, which we will talk about momentarily. So these two men have some bad blood, but nevertheless, they kind of need each other right now in this moment. And, spoiler alert, we know that they are going to sign a treaty together. And if you take a look down here, this is a Chinese stamp which commemorates the signing of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. So, my question to you: why do these two countries, these two men, Mao and Stalin, why do they need each other right now in this moment? Pause the video and think about that for a second. So, some things that you may have said. We are entering into the Cold War. Granted, the Soviet Union is an enormous country, but the Soviet Union has a lot of powerful countries arrayed against them. The United States and Canada and Western Europe, these are very powerful countries that could really threaten the existence of the Soviet Union. So they need an ally. They need allies. They're bringing countries in Eastern Europe under their sphere of influence, behind the Iron Curtain, the satellite countries. But China is an enormous country with a ton of potential, a massive army, a ton of potential were they to develop industrially. The two countries also share a border with each other. So these are some reasons why these two countries would want to draw close to one another in the first years of the Cold War. So in the description of this YouTube video, I will place a link or some links to whatever documents that I'm referring to in the presentation. So what I'd like you to do is follow that link, and I'd like you to read the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship in its original text, and then I want you to translate that legal language, the legalese, into plain, clear, simple English. As you've already seen in this course, when we're looking at treaties, they're written in very technical language, sometimes using a lot of jargon. And I want you to be able to cut through that and understand what the treaty is saying in plain terms. Then, there are two supplements to the treaty which are not included in the link I sent you. I will describe those to you. So here's another place. Pause your video, read the treaty, take pen and paper, and try to summarize what it means in your own words. And momentarily, I will give you my own summary. Alrighty, so let me move my icon. The first article: the Soviet Union and China will prevent aggression from Japan and their allies, which in this case means the United States. The two countries promise to defend one another, the USSR and the P.R.C. Second article: the two countries will secure a peace treaty with Japan. I guess at the point that this was created, that was not yet ratified. Third article: the Soviet Union and China will never enter into an alliance or a coalition against one another. Fourth article: the Soviet Union and China agree to discuss international affairs with one another so they can be on the same page with what each country is thinking in terms of international policy. Fifth article: they will respect one another's territorial sovereignty. They will respect one another's internal affairs. They won't try to meddle in the other country's internal affairs. Then they pledge to deepen economic and cultural ties. That will come into play with one of the supplements. And then the sixth article: this treaty will last for 30 years. I picked this propaganda poster. This is a Soviet propaganda poster showing a platonic relationship between two Chinese adult males and then two Chinese boys. Posters like this were trending on social media maybe a year or two back because people thought it was funny. It looked like communist China and Soviet Russia were like really progressive in terms of LGBT rights, but that's actually not what's going on here. When we look at these posters through a 21st century lens, we're like, oh, it's a gay couple with their like gay adopted kids, but it's not the case. What we're actually seeing here is a representation of like Soviet platonic friendship. So we have adult males and then like two boys that are friends with one another. And this is a pretty common theme in the artwork at this time. Propaganda posters, you'll see like a Soviet woman and a Chinese woman, a Soviet man and a Chinese man, and they're like embracing one another, and they're embracing each other, and it's like camaraderie. They're embracing one another in a platonic way. Let's take a look at those two supplements. Let me make myself a little smaller. First supplement. So that railroad I had mentioned before, Chiang Kai-shek had signed it over to the Soviet Union. Well, the first supplement stated that railroad network, which you can see pictured here in this map, will be turned back over to China much earlier than it should have been. Now, why does this matter? Well, if you look at the map here, you can see we're talking about a very significant rail network. And furthermore, I want to say that this area here, northeastern China, historically was called Manchuria. Today, one of the provinces here is Heilongjiang. This area is an industrial heartland. There are tons of resources here. There's a lot of mines. There's coal. There's iron. This is one of the areas that the Japanese and the Soviets started to build up in terms of industrial infrastructure. So China really wants to have this industrial heartland back, and they gain that with the first supplement. The second supplement was an enormous loan given to China by the Soviet Union with an insanely low interest rate, a credit of $300 million US dollars, obviously translated to a currency so that we can understand it, with an insanely low 1% interest rate provided to China by the Soviets in the form of industrial equipment, machinery, and various kinds of material that they would need to quickly build up their heavy industry. That's something we'll talk about when we talk about the first and second 5-year plans. In equal parts of 60 million US dollars over the course of 5 years. Repayment would take place over the course of 10 years, and it could be in the form of grain instead of money. That will come into play down the road when Chinese agriculture is failing, but they still feel an obligation to pay their loan to the Soviet Union. So our propaganda poster here, we have a Soviet industrial technician or expert shaking hands with a Chinese technician or engineer, and we have some, very heavy industry in the background there. Another element, which isn't a supplement, but another notable component of this treaty, is that Mao needed to accept that Mongolia would be quote unquote independent, but in actuality, a socialist republic that was under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. So here's Mongolia. If you can see my cursor, Soviet Union, Mongolia, China. Now, why does this matter? Well, because under the Qing dynasty, Mongolia had been absorbed into the Qing Empire. So China saw Mongolia as their sphere of influence, but they had to turn that over to the Soviet Union. So here's another opportunity where I'd like you to pause, and I'd like you to think about these three things. Sino-Soviet Treaty. What did China get? Then, at what cost to China? And then I'd like you to think back to the treaties from the 1800s, those unequal treaties that we took a look at, and think about this one in contrast How is it different from the previous treaties? And maybe how is it the same? But certainly different. So pause here, take a stab at these 3 questions, then I will show you the answers in a moment. Alrighty, so let's take our first box. What did China get? China got their Manchurian railroad network back in China's industrial heartland. That's a pretty big deal. 300 million US dollars worth of industrial machinery. That's pretty awesome. I'm sorry, I didn't mention this before, but in addition to the equipment, the Soviets were going to send Soviet experts to help the Chinese to develop their industry. Um, and lastly, a enormous communist ally who's offering security against China's potential enemies. At what cost, though? Well, they do need to repay the loan with interest, but the interest is very low. They're going to pay it with a lot of grain, and that seemed okay at first. But when China goes into the second 5-year plan, also known as the Great Leap Forward, um, they're going to fail tremendously, and the Chinese people are going to be starving, dying from starvation, and China is going to be shipping grain to the Soviet Union so that they don't lose face. Unfortunately, they have to give up the sphere of influence. They have to give up Mongolia, having control over Mongolia. By cozying up to the Soviet Union, they're now clearly indicating that they are not going to, be approachable to the West. And at what cost? Stalin had the upper hand in the negotiations. Last piece here, though, you know, for the P.R.C, how does this play for this brand new country? Well, look at the treaties that they had been signing with foreign powers in the 1800s. The treaties were awful. Those unequal treaties, as China calls them. So China is getting a lot, and yes, they do have to make concessions, but most treaties have a give and take. So this is going to play pretty well for the Chinese because it's a remarkably fair treaty that is providing a lot for China. Alrighty, so let's talk about the Korean War. And at first here, I'm just going to give some general information about how this conflict began before we talk about China's role. So I'll go through this a little more quickly. During the Second World War, the Allied powers, the Soviet Union, Britain, the United States, France, they had various meetings. It was really Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. They had various meetings where they were deciding what the world was going to look like after the Axis powers were defeated. One thing they discussed is what's going to happen over in East Asia. So the Korean Peninsula was pretty arbitrarily divided. The line was drawn up by 2 Americans. They had a National Geographic map of the peninsula, and they drew a line across at the 38th parallel because it was about half. And it was decided that the Soviet Union would have a sphere of influence in the northern half. The US would have a sphere of influence in the southern half. And after World War II, after the dust had settled, the 2 sides would hold elections and the peninsula would be reunited under one government. And both sides promised that they would abide by this pretty unrealistic plan. Knowing how these 2 countries are so ideologically opposed to each other, the plan was pretty unrealistic. Nevertheless, it's what they had agreed upon. So in North Korea, the Soviet Union brought up this man here, Kim Il Sung, a Russian-speaking, Russian-educated Korean with no political background. And in fact, there were other candidates who had more political background, but they were considered, they wouldn't be, they wouldn't listen to the Soviet Union. They were considered to be too much of a risk. Now, in South Korea, the United States backed this guy, Syngman Rhee, a Christian and hardcore anti-communist, lived most of his life outside of Korea. He lived in Shanghai, lived in the USA. He was not, universally beloved, and he had accusations of corruption against him. So my point here is that these 2 candidates that were picked were, heavily backed by an outside power, not necessarily beloved by the Korean people themselves. So how does the conflict begin? North Korea, if you take a look at these little maps here that I've put, North Korea invades South Korea and just steamrolls over the South Korean defenses. The South Koreans were taken by surprise. Um, I should point out that um, Kim Il sung did get permission from the Soviet Union. He let China and the Soviet Union know that he was going to do this. Stalin told Kim Il sung, hey, if you need support, turn to the Chinese. So North invades South in a surprise attack, steamroll them, push the Southern forces all the way to this port city of Busan, spelled here with a P, but in Korean, it's like a P/B sound, Busan, Busan. So there was just a very small perimeter around this city, and they were holding out. Then a famous World War II general, Douglas MacArthur, who was stationed over in Japan during the American occupation of Japan, he put forces together and he carried out this extremely ballsy seaborne invasion of Incheon. So he took his forces, if you see my cursor down here to Busan, he took forces around by sea and landed them at Incheon, and the Allied forces pushed north. I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. The United States went to the United Nations and asked the United Nations to intervene on behalf of South Korea. Now, the Soviet Union was on the Security Council, and the Soviet Union could have vetoed this decision. However, the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council meetings at that time because the Security Council was not recognizing the P.R.C. They were continuing to recognize the Kuomintang in Taiwan. So, in frustration, the Soviet Union was boycotting Security Council meetings. The US took the opportunity and they put this decision on the table and they said, "Hey, we got to support South Korea. They were unjustly invaded." And without the Soviets there to veto it, it went forward. So we had a combined US UN force fighting against the North Koreans, and they pushed them all the way back to the border with China, the Yalu River. Another moment for you to pause here. I'd like you to think. Imagine you are the PRC. Should we intervene in the Korean War? Yes or no? And a couple of things for you to consider here. So I'm going to give you a moment to pause and think about it. Some of the reasons as to why China would or would not intervene. Yes, China needs to protect their territorial integrity, protect their sovereignty. Other countries need to respect the PRC. They want to show that they can cooperate with other communist countries, the Soviet Union as well as North Korea. They want to push back against U.S. encroachment. If North Korea fell, the U.S. would be on their border. China wants to show that they're a power to be reckoned with, put some respect on our name. And if they succeed, the Chinese would have stood up to one of the greatest capitalist superpowers. On the other hand, China is a brand new country. They are exactly 1 year old. The U.S. is very established. They are a superpower, a nuclear power. They could not only defeat them on the battlefield, the U.S. could invade mainland China. By getting involved, they could be further antagonizing these Western powers that might not have felt antagonized. China's still wrapping up their own domestic problems, and their economy is completely underdeveloped right now. But in the end, the Chinese decide to intervene in the conflict, and 1 million or more Chinese quote-unquote volunteers cross over the border with North Korea to help the North Koreans. I'm going to pause here because we're coming up to 30 minutes. But this painting here is from a martyrs cemetery in Shanghai from when I lived there. And I just love this painting because it shows the Korean War from the perspective of the PRC. This was a war to defend their sovereignty. This was a war to help out a neighbor. This was a war to stand up to the greatest capitalist superpower, capitalist and imperialist superpower in the world. So here we can see the Chinese very valiantly standing and fighting in the face of U.S. jets strafing them and American tanks blasting away at them. And so in our next installment, we will pick up with the rest of the conflict.